Mothers are supposed to protect. They're the ones who care for you, who hold you when you're afraid, who comfort you when the world feels too big and too harsh. But what if a mother did the opposite? What if she became the very thing her children should fear? What would drive a woman to shatter the sanctity of her own home, to take the lives of those she vowed to love unconditionally? This is the story of Sarah Whitman, a mother whose life seemed perfect, whose family seemed unbreakable. On the outside, she had it all: a beautiful home in the quiet town of Springfield, Illinois, a successful husband, 3 bright children, and a life that many would envy. But what appeared to be a perfect family was built on fragile ground, and when cracks began to show, they would shatter everything in their path. Sarah Whitman's husband, James, was a man of charm. Successful in his career, popular among his peers, but behind closed doors, he had a secret. A secret that, when exposed, would change everything. James had been unfaithful. The betrayal was more than just a slip-up, it was a constant affair, an ongoing deception that Sarah could no longer ignore. The signs were all there, but she ignored them. Her love for him, or perhaps her need to believe in the good in him, blinded her to the reality. As Sarah's world began to crumble, so did her grip on her own sanity. It wasn't just the cheating that pushed her over the edge, it was the realization that her entire life, everything she'd worked for, everything she believed in, was a lie. Was the life she thought she had even real? How could she trust the man she had built a family with, the man who promised to cherish her forever? And as she grappled with that truth, the silence between her and James grew louder, the tension more suffocating. And then, in the early hours of June 15, 2023, everything erupted. The neighbors heard the screams, the kind of screams that make your blood run cold. They called the police, but by the time the officers arrived, it was already too late. The house, once filled with laughter, now lay silent, except for the echoing sirens outside. Inside, there was only chaos. Blood spattered across the walls, a lifeless body in the kitchen, and Sarah sitting in the living room, rocking back and forth. Her eyes vacant, her words incoherent. She muttered again and again, "He made me do it." But who was she talking about? Was it James, the man she once loved? Or was it someone else? The questions flooded in, each one more horrifying than the last. How could a mother, a woman who was supposed to nurture, protect, and care, commit such an unimaginable act? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't a random crime of passion. Sarah's actions, chilling as they were, seemed calculated. Evidence began to paint a disturbing picture, a picture of a woman who was unraveling, a woman whose grief and anger had festered into something monstrous. But was this the result of betrayal alone, or was there something more? What we know is this: there are no easy answers in this case. No neatly tied-up endings. What caused a mother, a wife, to do what Sarah Whitman did? Was it the heartbreak of her husband's infidelity? Or was it something deeper, something buried long before James's betrayal? The answers to those questions may never come, but one thing is certain: the story of Sarah Whitman is one that will haunt you long after the final moments. As we uncover the details, piece by piece, we will see that the truth is far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The family that once seemed perfect was, in reality, a powder keg waiting to explode. Tonight, we will walk through every chilling step of this story, and by the end, you will understand the horrifying truth of what happened that day. Stay with us. Sarah Whitman was once the picture of suburban tranquility. Her life seemed flawless from the outside: a loving husband, 3 beautiful children, a pristine home in Springfield, Illinois. James, her husband, was well known in the community, a successful businessman who charmed everyone he met. He would often come home with flowers for Sarah, or a new toy for the kids. Everything seemed perfect. But even the most perfect facades can crack. The cracks in their marriage began to show slowly at first. Sarah noticed the changes in James, a growing distance between them, late nights at the office, excuses, and unexplained absences. The little things that seemed insignificant at the time started to add up. Sarah, for the longest time, brushed off her suspicions. After all, who would suspect their partner of infidelity? She clung to the hope that it was just stress, or maybe just a phase. But deep down, Sarah could feel it, the growing emptiness between them. One evening, her worst fear came true. Sarah found a message on James's phone. It wasn't just a text, it was a conversation. Flirty, suggestive, and unmistakably intimate. It was from Rebecca Mills, her best friend. The one person Sarah thought she could trust above all others. In that moment, something inside Sarah broke. The betrayal wasn't just from her husband, it was from someone who had once been her confidant. Her world spun out of control, and everything she thought she knew about her life suddenly felt like a lie. Sarah confronted James that night. The argument was brutal. James tried to defend himself, but Sarah's emotions took over. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief, they all poured out in waves. How could he do this to her? To their children? Their family? How could Rebecca, someone she trusted, betray her in this way? James's only defense was that it was a mistake, that he was sorry, but those words meant nothing to Sarah. Sorry couldn't erase the devastation. It was then that Sarah began to unravel. She couldn't escape the thought of her husband with another woman, of the secret life he'd been living behind her back. It consumed her. Sarah started keeping a journal, writing down everything, the pain, the anger, the overwhelming need for revenge. Her mind, once sharp and clear, now felt clouded. She couldn't let go of the betrayal, and each day it gnawed at her from the inside. Her family, her children, were all that mattered to her, yet she couldn't stop herself from fixating on the hurt she felt. As weeks passed, Sarah's behavior grew more erratic. She would snap at the kids over the smallest things, her temper flaring for no reason. She began isolating herself from friends and family, unable to face anyone. She spent hours alone in her room, her thoughts a constant whirlpool of pain and rage. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the idea of making James pay for what he had done. But how? What could she do to make him understand what he had taken from her? In those moments of darkness, Sarah began to plan. At first, it was just fantasies, images in her mind of confronting James, of making him feel the same fear and despair she had felt. But soon, those thoughts turned into something darker. Something more real. And it wasn't just about James anymore. It was about reclaiming control over her life, taking back what had been stolen from her. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, until there was no room for anything else, no room for love, no room for forgiveness. Only vengeance. Then, on June 15, 2023, the unthinkable happened. The neighbors reported hearing screams coming from the Whitman house just before 7:30 a.m. They were chilling, frantic, and filled with terror. Moments later, police arrived at the scene. The house was eerily quiet, the front door ajar. Inside, they found the bodies of James and the 3 children, Lily, 9, Thomas, 7, and Emma, 4. The scene was horrific. Blood was everywhere, splattered across the walls, the floor, the furniture. The violence was unrestrained, brutal. It was clear that this was not a crime of passion, it was something far more calculated. Sarah was found in the living room, sitting on the floor. Her clothes were soaked in blood, her hands trembling. She was in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her eyes were vacant, staring into nothingness. When the officers approached her, she whispered over and over, "He made me do it." The words were haunting, and they left the investigators with more questions than answers. What could have driven Sarah to commit such an unimaginable act? What had happened in the hours leading up to this tragedy? The investigation began almost immediately, and the more they uncovered, the more chilling the story became. Sarah was arrested and taken into custody, but she remained largely unresponsive during questioning. She spoke in fragments, her mind seemingly lost to the chaos. The police turned their attention to the house, combing through every inch of the crime scene. It didn't take long for them to find a bloody kitchen knife, its handle slick with crimson, lying on the floor near James's body. Sarah's fingerprints were all over it, but there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if James hadn't even fought back. It was too easy. Too controlled. The police found something else too, Sarah's journal. The pages were filled with anger, desperation, and disturbing thoughts. There were mentions of revenge, of imagining James's death, of wanting to hurt him in a way that would make him feel the same hopelessness she had felt. But there were no direct plans, no clear timeline. The journal was a window into Sarah's mind, but it only raised more questions. Did she really mean to carry out these fantasies? Or had something pushed her over the edge in the moment? Then, the detectives uncovered something truly unsettling. Sarah had erased 2 hours of security footage from the house's cameras. What had happened during that time? Where had Sarah gone? And why would she erase the evidence? The missing footage was a red flag, something that hinted at a deliberate attempt to hide the truth. But what was she trying to cover up? As the investigation continued, the authorities found disturbing new details. Sarah's best friend, Rebecca Mills, who had been the catalyst for Sarah's emotional breakdown, had been involved in more than anyone had realized. Rebecca's phone records showed several calls and text messages exchanged with Sarah in the days before the murders. It appeared that Sarah had confided in Rebecca, that she had sought her out for support. But was Rebecca truly supporting her? Or was she manipulating her, pushing her further into darkness? Rebecca was brought in for questioning. At first, she denied any involvement, insisting that she had no idea Sarah was capable of violence. But as the pressure mounted, Rebecca cracked. She admitted that she and Sarah had discussed James's betrayal in detail, that Sarah had talked about wanting to hurt him. But Rebecca claimed that she never thought Sarah would actually go through with it. She said they had only planned to scare James, to make him understand what he had done to Sarah. But something had gone terribly wrong. Sarah hadn't just scared James, she had killed him, along with their children. Rebecca's confession raised even more questions. Had she been complicit in Sarah's actions? Or was she just an innocent bystander who had been caught up in Sarah's madness? Could she have stopped Sarah? And if so, why didn't she? As the case moved forward, the full scope of Sarah's breakdown began to emerge. Her psychological state had deteriorated rapidly in the months leading up to the murders. She had stopped taking care of herself, stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She had become a shell of the woman she once was, consumed by the pain of betrayal and the need for revenge. The question that loomed over everything was whether Sarah had ever truly been in control of her actions. Or had the years of emotional turmoil pushed her beyond the point of reason? The trial that followed was one of the most harrowing in recent memory. The defense argued that Sarah had been suffering from severe mental illness, that the combination of her husband's infidelity and the emotional abuse she had endured for years had pushed her into a psychotic state. The prosecution, however, maintained that Sarah had acted with full intent, that she had carefully planned the murders in a fit of rage. In the end, the jury convicted Sarah of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a verdict that brought little closure to anyone involved, especially to the community that had once seen Sarah as a loving mother and wife. But the questions remained. Was Sarah truly insane, or had she simply lost control in the heat of the moment? Had Rebecca played a bigger role in the murders than she admitted? And what about the missing footage? What had really happened during those 2 hours of erased footage? The case of Sarah Whitman continues to haunt the town of Springfield, Illinois. It's a chilling reminder of how far the human mind can be pushed, and the terrifying consequences that can follow when love, betrayal, and pain collide in a perfect storm. The community of Springfield, Illinois, had never been the same after that tragic morning on June 15, 2023. The Whitman family's home, once a symbol of suburban bliss, now stood as a chilling reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Neighbors who had once waved hello to Sarah and James in passing now locked their doors a little tighter, their lives forever altered by the brutality of a crime they could never have imagined. But the questions surrounding Sarah Whitman's actions didn't just end with her arrest. They lingered, hanging in the air like an unsolved puzzle that refused to be pieced together. What drove her to murder her husband, her children, and ultimately, her own life as she knew it? Was it the betrayal of her husband, James, or was it something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface all along? And why did she choose that moment to strike, after years of quiet suffering? These questions were not just about understanding Sarah, they were about understanding the darkness that can lie within even the most seemingly ordinary people. In the weeks that followed Sarah's arrest, the community struggled to process the events. Sarah had been a well-liked woman. She had attended PTA meetings, volunteered at local events, and was even known for hosting neighborhood gatherings. To think of her now as a murderer was a painful contradiction for those who had known her. Friends and family members tried to make sense of the person they thought they knew. How could a mother, a woman who had once been a beloved member of the community, turn into a cold-blooded killer? One person who struggled the most to come to terms with Sarah's actions was her own mother, Evelyn. Evelyn had raised Sarah to be strong, to persevere through the tough times, and to keep her family together. But when Sarah called her from jail after the murders, Evelyn was left speechless. Her daughter's voice was shaky, hollow. She could barely comprehend the reality of the situation. It was as if the woman who had raised her was no longer there, replaced by something else entirely. Evelyn visited Sarah in jail multiple times, hoping to understand what had led her to commit such a horrific crime. During their conversations, Sarah often stared blankly at the walls, her words coming out in fragmented sentences. It was clear that she was struggling to understand what had happened herself. She would sometimes refer to James's betrayal in vague terms, but it was never clear whether she fully recognized the magnitude of her actions. She spoke of the moment of the murders like it was a dream, as if she had been detached from reality. The more Evelyn spoke with Sarah, the more she began to believe that her daughter's mental state had been deteriorating long before the affair came to light. Sarah's journal entries, which were later released to the public, revealed a woman spiraling into madness, consumed by a toxic mixture of grief, anger, and paranoia. One entry read, "I can't breathe anymore. Every breath feels like a lie, a betrayal. I can't let him get away with this. He took everything from me." The journal chronicled the dark evolution of Sarah's thoughts, starting with small doubts and growing into full-blown delusions of vengeance. The more the investigation delved into Sarah's life, the more troubling details emerged. It was discovered that she had been secretly seeking therapy for months before the murders. However, her therapist, Dr. Rachel Thompson, had seen only a fraction of Sarah's emotional unraveling. In the sessions, Sarah had talked about her marriage, her children, and her fears, but there was always an underlying current of something else, a sense that she was slowly losing control of herself. Dr. Thompson had noted that Sarah was becoming increasingly paranoid, often questioning the loyalty of those closest to her, including her children. But even Dr. Thompson had no way of knowing the full extent of Sarah's mental deterioration. Sarah's anger toward James was more than just about the affair. As time passed, it became clear that she had been grappling with feelings of inadequacy for years. The affair had exposed not just her husband's disloyalty, but also the deep insecurities that had been festering within her for a long time. It wasn't just the fear of losing her marriage, it was the fear of losing her identity. Sarah had been a stay-at-home mom for most of her adult life, and she had poured everything into her family. When James betrayed her, it was as if her entire world came crashing down. She no longer knew who she was, or where her place in the world was. At the same time, Sarah's relationship with her children had begun to show signs of strain. Lily, her oldest daughter, had begun to pull away from her. The once close bond they shared had started to deteriorate. Lily's friends later told investigators that she had noticed her mother becoming increasingly withdrawn and irritable in the months leading up to the murders. Sarah had become obsessed with the idea that her children were somehow reflecting her pain back at her. She felt that they were rejecting her, even as she tried to cling to them. The bond that once held the family together was unraveling, and Sarah couldn't stop it. Sarah's children were laid to rest, their memories preserved by the few who still remembered their laughter and light. As for Sarah, she remains behind bars, her life forever changed by a moment of unspeakable violence. After her conviction, Sarah Whitman was transferred to a high-security prison in Joliet, Illinois, where she would spend the rest of her life. Behind bars, she became a ghost of her former self. Her once vibrant presence, the woman who had hosted dinner parties and PTA meetings, was now a mere shadow. She rarely spoke to anyone, her eyes hollow, her mind seemingly trapped in a never-ending cycle of regret and confusion. Her cell was her only refuge, a place where she could retreat from the relentless scrutiny of the world. In the first few months, Sarah received letters from her mother, Evelyn, who had never truly given up on her daughter. Despite everything that had happened, Evelyn still believed that Sarah was a victim, someone who had been broken by the trauma of betrayal, someone who had fallen prey to forces beyond her control. Evelyn's letters were filled with words of encouragement, with reminders of the good times in Sarah's life, and pleas for her to find peace. But Sarah's responses were sparse and disconnected. It was clear that she was lost, unable to fully process the magnitude of her actions. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover Sarah's case, offering updates, speculation, and analysis. Some outlets treated her like a monster, focusing solely on the horrific nature of the crime. Others took a more sympathetic approach, framing her as a woman pushed too far, a victim of her circumstances. But there was one thing the media had missed, the possibility that Sarah was not just a woman driven to madness by her husband's infidelity. There was a growing theory that Sarah had been slowly unraveling for years, that the crime was the result of years of hidden trauma, of a life that had been steadily deteriorating long before James's betrayal. In the months after her trial, more and more details came to light about Sarah's past. It wasn't just her husband's affair that had pushed her over the edge, it was the culmination of years of emotional neglect, isolation, and untreated mental illness. Sarah's childhood had been marked by instability. Her father had left when she was just a child, and her mother had struggled with depression, often absent both physically and emotionally. Sarah had always felt like she had to take on the role of caretaker for both her mother and younger siblings, and as she grew older, that burden had only intensified. She had spent her teenage years trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect student, and later, the perfect wife and mother. The pressure of those expectations, coupled with the emotional void she had been living with, began to manifest in ways Sarah could not control. It wasn't until after her arrest that investigators uncovered a pattern of psychological instability stretching back years. Sarah had been in therapy on and off throughout her adult life, but it was clear that the therapy sessions had never truly addressed the underlying issues that were eating away at her. Her self-esteem had always been fragile, and the weight of her husband's infidelity had shattered it completely. But the truth was, Sarah had never really been able to love herself in the first place, and her inability to process her emotions had led her down a dangerous path. Sarah's connection to her children, particularly her oldest daughter, Lily, had been a point of contention for years. Lily had always been a sensitive and perceptive child, and she began to notice the cracks in her mother's behavior well before the tragedy. There had been times when Lily would come home from school to find her mother sitting in silence, staring blankly at the walls, lost in her thoughts. There had been moments when Sarah seemed disconnected from reality, unable to bond with her children the way she once had. But Lily, in her innocence, never understood the depth of her mother's suffering. She just knew that something wasn't right. She just knew that the woman who used to be so full of life and laughter had changed. In the years following the murders, Sarah's story became a case study in criminal psychology. Experts debated whether she had been suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of the killings, or whether she had been fully aware of her actions. Some believed she had been experiencing a psychotic break, while others argued that she had been acting with cold, calculated intent. But there was one thing that no one could deny: Sarah's emotional collapse had been gradual and relentless, building up for years until it finally erupted in an unimaginable act of violence. As Sarah's case continued to haunt the media, it also became a point of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and armchair detectives. Online forums and social media platforms buzzed with theories, analyses, and debates. Some believed that Sarah had been driven to murder by the pressure of her marriage, others argued that the affair was merely a catalyst for something that had been building within her for years. A small but growing group of people suggested that there might have been something more sinister at play, perhaps a hidden motive, a secret that Sarah had kept locked away for years. One particularly troubling theory emerged when an anonymous source claimed to have information about Sarah's relationship with her husband that had never been made public. The source suggested that Sarah had been aware of James's infidelity long before she found the evidence on his phone. In fact, they claimed that Sarah had been following James for months, tracking his movements, and secretly watching his every interaction with Rebecca Mills. This, some argued, could explain Sarah's eventual breakdown. She had been living in a constant state of paranoia, watching her husband slip away from her, unable to confront the reality of what was happening until it was too late. The mystery surrounding Sarah's state of mind grew deeper when investigators received an unexpected tip. A former colleague of Sarah's from her brief time working at a local bank came forward with startling information. The colleague, who had known Sarah for several years, claimed that Sarah had confided in her about the affair long before the evidence was discovered. But what the colleague revealed next was even more chilling. Sarah had told her that she had been planning something that would make James pay for what he had done. The colleague, however, had brushed it off as idle chatter, until she heard about the murders. In hindsight, she realized that Sarah had been making her plans much earlier than anyone had realized. With these new revelations, the mystery surrounding Sarah's motivations deepened. Had she been planning the murders from the very moment she found out about the affair? Or was it a spontaneous act of rage, fueled by months of pent-up anger and betrayal? The truth seemed more elusive than ever. Despite the growing awareness of Sarah's emotional unraveling, it wasn't until the release of additional evidence that investigators began to piece together the full scope of her mental state. Phone records and security footage revealed that Sarah had been doing more than just following James's movements. She had been actively researching revenge, studying cases of other women who had killed out of betrayal. She had even visited the local library to check out books on criminal psychology, looking for answers to questions she could not yet voice. Some of her online searches included phrases like, "how to get away with murder," and, "emotional abuse signs in marriage." This new information painted a more chilling picture of a woman who had been planning her next steps with methodical precision, driven by a mix of pain, resentment, and an overwhelming desire for control. In the years that followed Sarah's conviction, a documentary crew was granted access to her prison cell, hoping to shed light on her state of mind and the motivations behind the murders. The crew spent weeks interviewing Sarah, but her responses were cryptic, sometimes incoherent, as if she were still lost in the web of her own thoughts. During one of the interviews, Sarah was asked directly about the murders, why she had killed her children, why she had ended their lives along with James's. Sarah looked at the interviewer with vacant eyes, her voice a whisper. "I didn't want them to hate me. I didn't want them to feel what I felt. I didn't want them to turn out like me." The statement left the interviewer stunned, for it revealed a level of self-loathing that no one had fully grasped. It was as if Sarah had been trying to protect her children from becoming something she despised in herself, a woman consumed by hatred and betrayal. Her words would stay with the investigator who had worked on the case for years. Sarah's final admission seemed to confirm something that had been suspected all along, that she had never been in full control of her actions. She had been a woman, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotion, trying to navigate a world that had left her feeling powerless. The tragic end of the Whitman family had not been the result of a singular moment of rage, but the culmination of years of deep psychological wounds that had never been properly addressed. And now, Sarah, sitting alone in her prison cell, was left to reckon with the devastation she had caused. As we come to the end of this haunting story, the questions still remain. What drove Sarah Whitman to commit such an unimaginable act? Was it the betrayal of her husband, or was there something deeper at play? Could the tragedy have been prevented, or was it the result of a woman pushed too far by years of hidden pain and emotional neglect? The answers may never be fully understood, but one thing is certain: the impact of this tragedy will echo through the lives of everyone involved for years to come. The haunting reality of what happened in the Whitman home on June 15, 2023, will never be forgotten. We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think truly drove Sarah to commit such a horrific crime? Was she a victim, or was she fully aware of her actions? Drop your theories and opinions in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this case as chilling and captivating as we did, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more deep dives into the most mysterious and heart-wrenching true crime stories. Stay tuned for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And remember, sometimes, the truth is far more complicated than we ever imagined.